Welcome to the Zachrilege Cast podcast, YouTube video interview program that features me talking to some of the best and brightest in the atheist / secular / awesome community. This is episode number 107. I'm recording live on August 8th, 2017. My most humble, heartfelt thanks go out to last week's guest, Thomas Westbrook of Holy Kool-Aid, one of the best YouTube channels out there. Check it out. So, I started this podcast journey with a bit of privilege. Now, look at me, pale, male, straight, red-blooded, as most of us are, American, who enjoys a malted beverage from time to time along with some sporting events. I have it made, most of the time. Not everybody has this fortune. When I figured that I was different and the superstitions that were the driving force of most of my friends and colleagues had no sway over me, I felt a bit left out, most of the time. What saved me was the world of podcasts. Tonight's guest, Wendy Marsman, listens to almost as many podcasts as I do, and she gracefully puts herself out there with the relatively new show called Women Beyond Belief. There's a tremendous amount of bullshit flying around these days, but I think it takes listening to other stories to bring us back, and I'm glad for the few hours I've spent listening to her and her lovely family. Welcome aboard, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Zach. I'm really privileged to be part of your podcast today.
Now, we do have an official Canadian here, so you're in the, was it Hamilton area, you said?
Yeah, about an hour from Toronto.
Okay, so it's same time zone, but much better health care. We'll get there, though. Now, usually I do out-of-context quotes, but I don't know. I feel like an in-context quote is good, so we don't know that we have a voice is the one I'm going to use. So it's tough to ask someone, hey, can you just summarize the first 40 years of your life? But could you tell me what your religious background was growing up?
Well, I grew up in a very fundamentalist evangelical home. My father said he was an atheist, but he practiced most of the fundamentalist religious rules that are portrayed in the Old Testament. And Bill Gothard and Bill Gothard and James Dobson and Chuck Swindoll and those types of people were the guiding light for my parents and how they raised my brother and I. So we had a very strict home. And I went to a missionary church. It was a denomination that was actually called Missionary Church. And so pretty much every Sunday night, there were missionaries that would come from around the world and, on their furloughs, they'd come and share with the congregation about the amazing life they had as missionaries and how they were spreading the gospel. So I was influenced from a very young age. I accepted the Lord when I was 7, prayed the sinner's prayer and was threatened about hell. So I didn't want to go to hell. So I said the prayer and from then on was true blue Christian and went to Christian schools my whole life and went on 3 short-term mission trips when I was in high school with Youth for Christ and really felt that during those trips that I was, I saw a little bit of the world outside of North America and saw the need for humanitarian aid and also just it seemed like to spread the gospel because people didn't know about Jesus certain places. So I went from there to after high school, went to cook's training. And then after that, I went to Bible college. I went to a very strict Bible college. It's actually the oldest fundamentalist evangelical Bible college in Canada. And it's one where Fred Phelps, who started Westboro Baptist Church, he went to that church, that school, and Elizabeth Elliot, who was the author of Through Gates of Splendor, and other people who've been influential. So it was a fairly influential school in its early days in terms of spitting out fundamental people. So I went to that Bible school for 1 year, and I met my first husband there, who was a missionary kid from Papua New Guinea. And his parents had been with a certain mission that we decided when we first met each other that both of us wanted to go to the mission field too. So that was one of the things that drew us to each other. And way too young. I was 19 when he proposed and didn't really think through very much. I was pretty much raised in a family where you know, the women have a role and the men have a role, and the women's role is to stay home and have kids and be a good wife. So I knew I wanted to go to the mission field. So it was, you know, be a good wife and have kids and be on the mission field. So after we had been married for 2 years, we applied with the mission. And by the third year of our marriage, I was pregnant and we were accepted into the mission. And we were posted in Brazil. And so we went to Brazil when my first child, who was a son, was 9 months old. We flew to Brazil and we didn't know any Portuguese. So it was a challenging first year because we needed people, you know, to help us get our tourist visas renewed and go to the grocery store for us. And it was, you know, difficult to not know the language. So we realized, you know, we needed to take some language training. So we took language training after my daughter was born. She was born down there in Brazil. And we realized that we needed to, like, we went down initially as short-term assistants. They didn't normally accept full-time career missionaries right off the bat. They usually wanted people to come down and just see if they, you know, if it was a good fit with the mission. So we decided, yep, we wanted to be career missionaries. And so we came back, lived in North Carolina, took the training, and then went back to Brazil. Our third child was born down there. And we came back 2 more times after that. And each of those times we would travel across the country and speak at churches and mission conferences and do the typical furlough fundraising, because the mission we were with required 100% of our support to be raised by us. They didn't help us at all, whereas other missions, they would give the missionaries a salary or 50% salary, and then the missionaries would just have to raise half of it. But for our mission, you had to raise all of it yourself. So it was a lot of work. We got to see a lot of the North America, traveling back and forth. My kids got used to traveling and, you know, across overseas flights lots and meeting lots of people and learning another language. And so it was a lot of adventures. Being a missionary in Brazil was a challenge. We lived in the Amazon area, so there wasn't as many creature comforts as at other mission bases that were more. There was one in Brasilia, which is the capital city, and their mission base was a lot easier to live on. We lived there for 4 months, I think, when we were doing some of the language training. But where we were based out of, and we lived for 8 years, was in the Amazon area. So it's, you know, it gets up to 80, 90 degrees by 8 in the morning every single day, year round. And so you just got used to having one wardrobe when you live in the tropics, and you get used to lots of bugs and putting on long sleeves at night if you go outside so that you don't get bitten by mosquitoes and get malaria. And yeah, it's quite a lot of work. There's not clothes dryers or hot running water or microwaves and things like that. So it takes a little bit more work to raise a family. And I was involved in the mission school for some of the time, and my husband was a maintenance construction person on the mission base. So he was in charge of the Brazilian workers that would come and help on the base, and also other short-term missionaries that would come down. And he was in charge of taking care of the houses that were on the base and making sure that the group cars would run and things like that. And I'd turn the generator on that would run the base. There was about 30 buildings on the mission base. And so when the power would go out, then we'd have what was called a brownout. So all of the lights would go down to about 70% power, and we'd have to run around the house and unplug everything so that it wouldn't blow the motors. And so, yeah, it was quite an adventure. I look back on it and I think, boy, I'm glad I did it when I was younger, because I had more energy back then.
Well, it wasn't just that. You were going like when you were having kids. I mean, just living a normal life and having kids, tough enough, but being in a foreign country where you didn't know the language at first, and maybe even when you did, you still were figuring out the customs. That's pretty impressive. And I didn't even think about the whole, Canadian super pale, like in the super heat, like how you're able to deal. And did you have to still dress, I guess, modestly during that time?
The first year I was, because I had been raised in a conservative home, and we had school uniform for the first 8 years of my life in the school that I was part of, and my mom only wore dresses. So I was quite conservative myself, and I think that first year I only wore skirts or dresses. But then I started realizing everyone else was wearing shorts and tank tops, so I sort of got used to wearing that. But yeah, and the Brazilians are. I mean, they know it's hot, so they don't wear very much. So the reputation of Brazil, is that they love their parties and they have their carnival in February, and but we tried to sort of separate ourselves because we were with the religious groups, so we didn't, and that I'm I'm I regret that my kids didn't get to see that side of Brazil. They sort of saw this little America. Most of the missionaries we were with were Americans. There was a few Brazilians and a few people from Argentina or Switzerland or England, but the majority of the people on the mission base were U.S. citizens. So it was different than the Bible translators who would actually go out into the villages for 4 to 6 weeks at a time, whereas we stayed on the mission base with mostly English speakers. So it's sort of, yeah, they called it Little America. It's not the greatest. Yeah, it's there's a lot of hang-ups that I think um, are passed on, sort of a colonialization that can happen, where they see, a lot of the people that were on the mission base when we got there had already lived there for 30 years, and so they had a little bit of Brazilian culture, part of their life, but the majority of it was as if they had walked out of, Montana or Idaho. They dressed like they would have if they were back in the States. So there wasn't a lot of integration, because the main goal of our mission, particularly, wasn't to evangelize the local Brazilians. It was to evangelize the indigenous tribes in that area. And so the tribes that our base was centered around, there was about 13 different languages in that particular area. There were 4 mission bases in Brazil with our mission. And on our mission base, there was 13 different villages that spoke all different languages. And so some of them some of them you'd have to get to using the Cessna 206 plane, and some of them you could drive with a four-wheel drive to get to. And then they would bring the Indians back to the mission base to help with the translation if they needed to, or if they were sick, and we'd have emergency flights where an Indian would have gotten a snake bite, and they'd send out the distress call on the radio, and we'd have the plane go out and pick them up and bring them back, and the nurse would take care of them on the mission base. So it was sort of a home base for the translators. So we were helping making life a little bit easier for the translators and providing a school for the translators' children and that type of thing.
So is that base still around?
They were starting to talk about closing it down when we decided to leave. We left eventually because there wasn't a high school there, and we didn't want to send our kids away to boarding school. And so we left when our oldest was going into middle school, grade 7, I think he was going into. But I think part of the base has been sold off to a Youth with a Mission organization next door, which we had actually sold part of the land to. So just a minute. But as the Indian, so with our mission, most of the missionaries just don't retire. So they're 60, 70-year-olds that are on that mission base that still go out into the villages, or if they aren't able to travel to the villages, they'll have the Indians come back to the mission base and they'll work on the translation there. And And so there was more and more people who were at that retirement age, and some were actually retiring. And so it seemed like there just wasn't as much a need for that mission base at that time, and our mission was downsizing. It was harder and harder to get visas. One of the reasons that we were able to stay as long as we did was we had a baby in Brazil. Our second baby, Sarah, she was born in Brazil, and that allowed us to apply for a permanent visa. So grandparents and close relatives, or maybe just grandparents and parents, are allowed to get a permanent visa if they have a child born in Brazil. So we called it the visa babies, because there was other people who would do that too. They'd have a baby in Brazil. So that's one reason we were able to stay longer there. But there were enough people that weren't able to get visas, and it was harder and harder to get teachers for the schools. So yeah, they decided to pretty much close, I think, most of our mission base down in the last 10 years. So we left in 2005. We left that mission base. So
I was wondering if they were having trouble getting new people to come in, or at a certain point when you're talking to indigenous people, they either like say, okay, Jesus, come on in, or no, I would think, and you would have to go one way or the other. Either you've succeeded or you've really failed. So I just wonder how long those things can go.
Yeah, so the goal of the translators with the mission we were part of, which was Wycliffe Bible Translators, their goal is to translate the language first, because a lot of these languages have never had their language written down. So the translators have to have, a degree in linguistics, and they go in and they start learning the language. They start creating primers and teaching the Indians how to read, how to write, how to do math. And then in part of those primers, they start to translate the scriptures. And the first goal is usually to start translating the New Testament. And that can take up to 30 years to actually get all the way through the New Testament, because most of our mission's goal was to have it pretty much word for word, even though in some Indian languages it was almost impossible to do it based on the type of language that they had, where it's impossible to translate certain things over. So it would be based on it was getting as close to the context as possible. Whereas a mission like New Tribes Mission, which is another fairly, I don't know actually if they're even calling themselves New Tribes Missions anymore, but that's what they were called for years and years. And their goal was, they would take the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they'd sort of squish them all together. This is what I understand. They'd squish them all together and make a condensed version. And the whole Bible, they would sort of create it based on, the stories of how God came into the world and created us and then brought his son into the world. So it was more story based instead of verse by verse by verse. Whereas our mission believed that, the Bible, that the Indians needed the full Bible. And there's very few Indian tribes who actually have full New Testament and Old Testament. Most people just get through the New Testament in their lifetime, and then maybe another translation couple or family will come in and start in on that same language and then finish the Old Testament, but that's not very common. So it's a big, big deal when a New Testament gets finished, because it can be, 30 years of that translator's lives. And it's, they print it up and they bring it in on the airplane in boxes, and they have a big shindig with the village. And I mean, certain villages, I think, take to the gospel better than other villages. I don't know if you've heard of Dan Everett. He's written a book, and he's got some talks on YouTube, and he's also had a TED Talk. And he's an interesting fellow. So he was actually on the mission base when we first went to Brazil. And his wife was quite influential to me, because she was very, very charismatic Christian. And I had no idea, but all the time that I knew him, he was actually a closeted atheist. And the Indians actually convinced him to become an atheist. So that's what his book is about.
Go one way. That's good.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting story. And but his family, and like I say, I did not even find this out till a year ago. So, the last time we had seen them in Brazil was 2004, 2005, after when we left, and then I didn't hear that he had come out as an atheist until last year, but I guess he had. I just hadn't kept up with him. And his two daughters were very influential in my life. Their kids were the same age as my kids. His youngest daughter, her and I went to the grocery store on a grocery store run every week, and her son was the same age as my daughter, and they played when they were in kindergarten. And so I was, that family, I have a lot of things in common with them. And then to find out their dad, was a atheist. He kept it a secret. Because, of course, once he came out, then he got a divorce because his wife was so spiritual and religious, and, that would have been the worst thing for her to ever do. And she's actually still working in the village, apparently. She still is convinced that she can, lead them to the Lord, even though he doesn't think it's ever possible, because they have absolutely no need for the Lord, no need for spirituality, and so they convinced him that he didn't need it either. So I recommend everybody to look him up. He's very interesting.
I was wondering if there's ever the real two-way street there, if it was just talking and the other side was like, okay, maybe you can give us stuff we need, but otherwise, yeah, we're not giving you anything in exchange.
Well, when we were down there, and what we would tell people, when we were on furlough and we speak at churches and stuff, I was so convinced that what our mission believed in was legit, and that, yes, everybody needed to hear the gospel. Everybody needed the Bible in their own language. And if they didn't have it in their language, they couldn't really have a true church. And so for these Indian villages to have a true church, they needed the Bible. But I don't, now that I'm out of Christianity and I'm an atheist, I can't comprehend any of it except for seeing it as colonialization. And, we're going down there because we think we know something better than you do, and we think we know it, and it's the gospel, and you better believe it. I just think it's so screwed up right now, that mindset, and it's still going on. There's still missionaries that are being recruited and going down there and, trying to convert these Indians. Some of them were better than others. Some of the translators, I think, really had a heart for the Indians and did help. Most of them would have to help them out with their physical needs if they needed that, But in general, the goal was to convert them. And I did remember hearing stories where the Brazilians would come in, a company would come into a Indian reservation, and they'd log, the huge trees in the Amazon area. They'd log the reservation, and the Indians, had no way of protecting themselves. And in payment for these huge logs going out on the logging trucks, that, the Brazilian company would give the Indians a ghetto blaster, back in the 70s or 80s. And the Indians thought, oh, this is wonderful, this modern contraption, and in payment for a whole truckload of amazing, mahogany or ironwood from the Amazon jungle. So in order, so those were the types of stories that we were told to tell churches, to say, look at what our missionaries are doing. They're teaching them how to read. They're teaching them math so that the Indians can understand that they're being taken advantage of. So those types of things seemed humanistic and seemed humanitarian to me, when I would hear it. So I was pretty sure that our mission wasn't as colonial as other missions maybe, but still I look back at it now and I regret being a part of that. I'm ashamed, that I was part of a religion that tried to convert other people who didn't ask for that. They didn't know what they were asking if they said, yeah, these Americans can come into our village and, be our friends. And whether supposedly it's supposed to keep their, keep their language intact and keep their culture intact if they have their language written down, and that their language would have possibly disappeared if it hadn't been written down. I don't know. Who knows? Who's to say that that actually would happen every single time? I mean, some of these Indian villages have been around for hundreds of years. Some of them are still being discovered. You know, the Amazon is just an amazing, massive area that I would not be surprised if there's still unknown language groups in there. And what says that, you know, who are we to say that we need to go in there and convince them to follow a God that if God is actually as big as we say he is, he would have gone and talked to them anyways. And that's a funny thing now that I hear, you know, now that I think about it, we would say things like, oh, well, every language group and every society has a creation story. I don't know if you've heard that statement before, but that's what we would say. That's what we were told to say. But that's actually not true. I found out, you know, not this blanket statement that every single language group and every single culture has a creation story. Apparently, that's actually not true. So I don't know. There was a lot of things that we were told to say to churches that we believed without actually looking at the evidence to see if this is actually true and this is actually a good thing. So I'm you know, I gotta understand it a bit more now from an atheist perspective to see if any of it has legit meaning. But I certainly don't agree with people being, you know, having the Bible their first book that's ever given to them is a Bible. You know, that's a little bit of a, I don't know.
Yeah, hit him up with some Darwin. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what was, I mean, you said you stopped going to Brazil, was it 2005? So what was the transition like for you coming out of religion and deciding that this wasn't the journey you wanted to continue?
Well, we came back to Canada with the full intention of going to Papua New Guinea. So Papua New Guinea had a school of 500 students, whereas the school in Brazil, you know, had 20 students and no high school. So we came back to Canada ready to get our visas to go on to Papua New Guinea so that our kids would have a high school to go to. And we were just going to continue being missionaries over there. And then we really got hit hard leaving Brazil because that was home for us. That had been really, you know, my kids had been in Brazil more than they'd been in Canada. All their best friends were there. And so we had a lot of grief that we started to encounter, and it's called reverse culture shock. And that sort of blindsided us. And we realized, okay, we need to spend a year at home, you know, not just 6 months waiting for our visa. So let's just wait it out for a year and then we'll go to Papua New Guinea. But we realized, okay, maybe we need to stay longer. Maybe we actually need to put roots down because my husband had gone to 13 different schools. His parents were very involved in the mission, and he'd moved around so many different times that he didn't want his kids to be moving around as much. So it was one good decision that he made that he wasn't going to repeat from his parents. And so we decided to buy our first house. We were so that was 2005. And we were in a little tiny town that we literally only knew 2 people in when we first moved there, because we were only going to stay there 6 months, we thought, and then move back to the mission field. So it wasn't a great place to land. We should have been at least, you know, closer to either closer to our home church, which at that point in time had been back on the West Coast. Whereas this was in Ontario where we ended up landing. And we had 15 different churches across the country that supported us, but our main home church was on the West Coast. So it wasn't a great place to land in that we didn't have a lot of support in that area. And so it was hard, you know, making friends from scratch. We lived in the parsonage of the Baptist church for the first few months, you know, until we got a house of our own. And my husband was a representative with the mission for 2 years. And they didn't really have enough for him to do. So it was really hard for me to write prayer letters and, you know, to keep keep the money coming in from our supporters. And so I basically said, you know, I don't want to be with the mission anymore. There's, you know, there's nothing really to write about. There's nothing to do for me. So you keep being at the mission if you want, but you got to write your own prayer letters. I told my husband, and he didn't want to do that. So he quit too. So we resigned. And so we had been with the mission from 1992 to 2007. And so 2007 was a tumultuous year. I found out that my husband had cheated on me for the second time, and that our marriage was on the rocks. So we went into counseling and slept in separate bedrooms and slowly came out of that difficult time. But it rocked my world, and I realized that I needed to make some changes. So I started taking away the rules from being a really strict parent, and trying to become more liberal. And then I started realizing I didn't like the church we were going to. It seemed really judgmental. So I stopped going to that church and started to see if I could stay a Christian outside of the church for about a year. I tried that. And my kids left the church as well. My husband actually left the church for about 6 months as well, too, and seemed on the road away from Christianity as well. But by the summer of 2009, there was a big blow up with my parents. And I stood up to my dad pretty much for the first time. And he didn't like that at all. And he hasn't spoken to me since that day. And my mom stayed on his side and agreed with him. And so I also stopped talking to her. So it's been 8 years since I've spoken to them. And that's been difficult. But I started to, one of the reasons I left my marriage, I left my marriage a year after I'd left the church. I realized that I was going to just be repeating, the bad marriage that my mom had exemplified. And I didn't want to do that anymore. And I wanted to give my daughters a better example, especially to find men that are worth being with, instead of being with a man who's abusive. So it's been a really rough road coming out of religion, because I don't have a relationship with my parents. And most of my Christian friends don't want to have anything to do with me because I'm one of those heathens now. So I've lost majority of my friendships, which has been a lonely road. The good side of all of it is that in 2008, I went to my 20-year high school reunion and met up with my now second husband. And I had dated him 20 years before in high school. And that was pretty neat for us to meet up after all these years. And he had left his first marriage. I was leaving my first marriage. And so, to make a long story short, we've blended our families. We've gotten married for the second time. And we've got 5 kids between the two of us. So life is busy. I don't know if I'm answering all your questions.
So you've had to kind of recover in 2 ways. Like you really haven't lived in Canada when you were doing all your mission times. You had to get used to being like a Canadian, and then you had to get over being the stereotypical, at least as far as you knew, Christian wife.
Yes.
What was the adjustment like there?
Oh boy. Yeah, I was a really good Christian. I didn't make any waves. I prided myself in having no enemies. I served in the church. I volunteered. I was on the missions committee whenever we were home on furlough, or before we even went on missions. I was in the choir. I was on the music team, playing my violin for worship time. I helped start a MOPS, which is a Mothers of Preschool group. I would help lead Bible studies, and I was really, really involved in the church whenever, before we left for Brazil. And actually, when we were in Brazil, I was part of the social committee on the mission base and helping to organize all of that kind of thing also. So we sort of had repeated it in Brazil. So, yeah, I was a good Christian wife, and I was very much a helicopter parent. Which was what we were told to be by James Dobson and Franklin Graham and Chuck Swindoll and all of those people tell you to be very responsible for your children, and your children are a representation of your parenting skills, and how they turn out is directly related to the parent. And being a more or less stay-at-home mom, I always had businesses on the side, but pretty much at home. Then it's up to me. So I was very involved in my kids' lives, as was my mom. So that was the example it was for me. And it's very screwed up. It's men's roles, women's roles. Men is head of the home, women comes next, the children are underneath you. You don't respect your kids. You're supposed to discipline them and love them, but you don't respect them. And it's not said, you're not told to not respect them. It's just the word respect is not even part of the vocabulary. And I'm learning that now, that it's so non-humanistic in terms of seeing your children as equals and as humans, and that their voice matters and all of that type of thing. So it's been a real big change for me to now be with a husband who is amazing. He does respect the kids. He respects them as much as he respects me. We're all equal in his mind, men, women. He's, incredibly respectful of everybody. And that's been very helpful. He's actually left religion since I've been with him. He was with the Christian Reformed Church when I first we lived together for 3 years and then got married. And he stopped going to church and took his kids out of Christian school and slowly started to extricate himself from religion as well. And now he's an atheist as well. But it's been challenging to, leave religion and become a secular wife and a secular parent. It's been a challenge.
And how many kids is that combined?
5.
5. Ooh.
Yeah, ages 15 to 24.
And on a fun age too.
Oh yeah.
Well, gosh, we've gone like 38 minutes so far, and we haven't even started talking about your show. But your story is something I think that people definitely need to hear, because it's not something you get every day. Even though last week Thomas was the son of missionary, so a little like a missionary connection between the episodes.
Yeah.
But what made you decide to do a podcast, and what was it like just getting it off the ground?
Well, I'd been wanting to write a book about 4 years ago. I went through some of my old emails to my brother. My brother came out of religion when he was in his late teens and went through some really difficult times. So he's been out of religion a lot longer than I was. I was, in a fundamentalist Christian for 20 years as an adult, and he was secular for 20 years. So he's been really helpful in my deconversion process. And I found an email I wrote to him 3 years ago or 4 years ago, where I said, I was really hoping to write a book about what it was like being a missionary, but sort of a memoir, I guess. And but some things happened in our world. We had to move multiple times. We've had health issues in our family. And so things kept getting put on the back burner. And then last year, about February, March, I realized I was just incredibly lonely. We'd moved again across the country this time, and I just needed some friends. And I thought, okay, maybe if I do podcasting, I'll get to know some people, because I loved listening to podcasts, and it had really helped change my worldview. So I started reaching out. I contacted Ryan Bell. I contacted a few other people, and they were all very encouraging. And then we had to move again. And at that point in time, we didn't realize that my husband was fighting cancer, but he had very low energy for that move. So I basically spent 4 months of, 4 months moving, and I didn't have a lot of help. So that was a difficult summer. And then we found out that my husband actually had cancer, and he went into chemo, had 6 months of chemo. So during that time, when we were not knowing what his diagnosis was, it was a really lonely time. So I reached out and joined the Clergy Project. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to get some support and some people here who might have something in common. And right away, Drew Bakis reached out to me and noticed that on my bio, I had written, that Everyone's Agnostic and some other podcasts, but Everyone's Agnostic podcast had been very influential in helping me leave religion or understanding where I was in my atheism. And so he said, "Oh, well, Cass Mitchley is here on the Clergy Project." And so he introduced me to him. And Cass read my bio and said, "Oh, I'll have you come on, in an interview in a couple months." So that was, the first time that I'd come out publicly to talk about my story, and as an atheist in that way. So that really sort of got the ball rolling. I mean, I had done probably 100 hours of preparation the year before, learning how to make podcast, all the technical side. So it was a lot easier to just slide in and start it up. Um, so I started the podcast on April 3rd, I think was my first episode, and I've had 25 episodes so far. So got 4 months under my belt. So I guess I really wanted to see the option of women having a voice, because when I was coming out of religion, all of the podcasts had male hosts. There once in a while there'd be, a female co-host, but there was never a theme of, this is run by women for women, talking about women's issues. So I saw a niche that needed to be filled a year ago, and then it still hadn't been filled a year later. So I thought, okay, I'll try it. We'll see if there's if this niche is actually legit, or if it's never going to, go anywhere. But it does seem to be filling a need. And I get emails from people who say, I also was hoping for a women focused group or podcast, and this is really meeting a need. So it's very, very encouraging. And I'm meeting all kinds of people. It's just amazing, all these women that were there, and I just had no way of knowing them. So now that I have this platform that I can offer to give them a voice, then I'm, able to meet wonderful, amazing people like Sarah Levin and Sarah Hayter. And then I have every 10 episodes, I interview a feminist man, a guy who's in agreement with female equality. So I had Seth Andrews on, and I had Brian Peck, and I recently interviewed Dave Warnock. His episode comes out in a couple weeks. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about the people I've been able to meet. It's just like opened up a whole world for me. So I'm hoping that as I give a platform to women and let them have a voice, that they also will be able to realize that they can speak up, that more women can come out, that we can show that there are a lot of women atheists there. And because I believe that they're there, but the stories that I hear, they're scared. They're scared to open up. Yeah, there's a lot of fear, and a lot of that goes back to our upbringing in the church, where women, we weren't allowed to speak up very much, if at all. So I get rambling, Zach. You gotta cut me off.
Oh, I think that's what it's all about. That's good. You go start. That's what I like to do with people. You get going on one direction, and then you take off on another one. You're on your skis, and you can adjust as well as you can.
Yeah.
On the fly. So how did you had to do a little negotiation to come up with your name. How did you do that for the show, the Women Beyond Belief?
Yeah, I had come up with about 12 to 15 names originally, and I had started to join the Facebook groups after I was interviewed on Cass and Bob's show in January. I think it was published in February. I got invited to join their private Facebook group. And so I had sort of a little bit of a group that I could ask their opinion of. So, and also Brian Peck, who works alongside Brian Peck, sorry. He was very encouraging too. So I put out a survey and asked people, out of these 12, or I don't remember how many names it was at that point. So it was sort of like a vote, and Women Beyond Belief was the top ranked vote. But I had heard that there was a woman by the name of Karen Garst who had written a book in last fall, and it was called Women Beyond Belief, Discovering Life Without Religion. And she had interviewed or gotten in touch with 22 other women, and each of them had a chapter in her book, and they were people who had come out of various different religions too. So I had no idea what doors of opportunity would open to me when I chose that um, title. So I contacted her because her book was was an actual published book. I didn't want to make the publishers upset, so I asked her, can I use that name for my podcast? And she said, "Oh, go for it, and you can use the domain name." So I, got the .com and the .org names, and she's been sending people my way to be interviewed, and she also records some of her blogs from her feminist um, faithlessfeminist.com blog website. And so we're sort of in, doing things together and collaborating, and it's been fantastic. She's been really helpful in this. So yeah, so the name's been good in terms of getting me connected with Karen, because if I'd just picked another name, I don't know, I might not have been where I am today. So she's been incredibly helpful.
Karen Garst, episode 66 of this show, and multiple episodes of your show.
Yeah.
So you asked me before the show, like, how do I find my guests? So I get to throw that one back to you. How do you find your guests? And do you sometimes find that the women you want to talk to are a little reluctant to speak? I know some have had to use pseudonyms, as I've had to deal with a few times.
Yeah, it's at the beginning, it was a challenge because I knew less than 10 people who I actually thought, oh, maybe I could interview them. And the majority of them have chosen not to be on my podcast for one reason or the other, usually because they haven't come out 100% to their family. And so that was really challenging at the beginning. And then once I actually launched, then I got a bunch of people right off the bat, which was great. And then it was a little bit of a lull. So in my closing comments on my podcast, I would give my, email address, which was womenbeyondbelief@gmail.com, and people could email me. So I got some response from that, and I actually still get some emails from those earlier podcasts, but I haven't been putting it in because all of a sudden, after Seth Andrews' podcast and also Brian Peck helped, he offered to do a bit of advertising one time, and it just shot up my ranking, and all of a sudden I had lots of people on. So I actually have 2 months lined up already, and some more people. Like I probably have the next 20 episodes of people. I just have to, schedule them in. So it's fantastic. I don't have to go out. I don't have to do very much cold calling or, cold emailing, whatever they call it. So that's been great. But yes, a lot of them do want to come on using a pseudonym, or they just want to use their first name. For one lady, it was because her children weren't completely out to their friends as atheists, so she didn't want to out her children. For other people, yes, they aren't out to their family, or they're out to part of their family but not the other. So I give them that option, to be completely anonymous if they want, and just send in a generic photo. And because I certainly don't want to be a podcast that gets people in trouble. That's not at all my goal. I want people who can tell their story, but I do want to give a voice to people who are still closeted, because there are other women who are closeted, who need to hear how they keep going in life, and how do they go about their life without this part of, their worldview being known to the world. So I'm interested down the road to interview some people after they've come out more fully, and to help, maybe 3 years from now, somebody who was using a pseudonym, I could interview them again with their real name, and they could talk about what that was like. I'm hoping to do this long term. So there's lots of, and I'd love to clone myself and do this full time and be able to, keep my job and take care of the kids. But I can't right now. But, and I'd love to help other women if they want to help, start podcasts. All the stuff that I've learned how to do, I could help other people learn how to do that. And if we want to start women's retreats, under the name Women Beyond Belief. Or one lady talked about starting a meetup group in her area and maybe using the name. So that's just so exciting, to just get the ball rolling and get the word out that there are women atheists. So
I like
yeah,
that being like a brand name. Wouldn't beyond belief. Oh
yeah.
yeah, I like that. Yeah, there's a secret handshake and all that.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned your kids. So how did you get your family involved in the production of your show?
Well, my husband, I first started listening to podcasts, I think it was 2008, and I would listen to, it was actually a Christian podcast called, um, oh, I can't remember the name of it now. Free Believers Network. And I had a little iPod shuffle and I'd go for walks and listen to that. And so I've been listening to podcasts for almost 10 years now. I know other people listened longer, but I hadn't. But so I love podcasts. And when I got together with my second husband, he's an avid science geek nerd and he loves listening to podcasts. And he has podcasts on every single day while he makes breakfast. So we all hear them. And so he's been encouraging, in terms of he loves podcasts. He thinks it's a great idea that I do it. My two daughters, my oldest daughter has a side business of doing websites and graphic design. So she helped me with the logo. And my younger daughter, who's 18, she loves music. She's an amazing piano player. She has taught herself how to play the piano. And she has a software program that helps her create, electronic music, computer music. So I asked if I could start using her music, and she keeps writing more for me. So yeah, it's sort of a family effort. It's good.
Yeah, for us solo practitioners doing this kind of on our own, it's hard to let go. So what was it like? What did you decide to have your daughter Sarah kind of lead the interview when you had ex-Muslim Sarah Hayter on your show?
Oh, that was a no-brainer because I had never even heard of Sarah Hayter until a few months ago because I'm still very new to the atheist movement and new to the secular movement and new to all of these. So I'm just starting to get to know the names of people and who's famous and who's well known. And my two older kids have been listening to Sam Harris for quite a few years already. My son and my older daughter, they listen to Sam Harris and they listen to um, more I mean, I would call it more controversial issues than I was comfortable listening to. And so when I had sent a request to Seth Andrews asking for his advice for people to interview back when I was first starting, and he mentioned Sarah Hayter. So when I told my older daughter that, she was just jumping up and down and said, "She's my hero. I would love to, help you with that interview." So it was sort of yeah, it was a good fit to have her help out. I'd love to have her help out more often. She's really busy with her. She's taking mechanical engineering in university, so she's pretty busy. But yeah, and she is so smart. My kids are just amazing how intellectually articulate they are. um, so I was very glad that she was willing to run that interview because I don't think I could have brought up the questions that Sarah did. My Sarah. Yeah.
Well, as a Christian woman, you're told to be very modest and to probably not give yourself a lot of attention. But in your interviews, you're pretty open, like on everybody's agnostic. That was you pretty much talked about everything about yourself. And when you were talking, your first interview was with your daughter, and you were even talking about like sexuality. Was it tough to make that kind of transition? Because it seems like at this point in your life, you're fairly an open book, and if someone asks a question, you're going to answer it.
Yeah, I am trying to be an open book after, so many years of keeping quiet, not talking about certain subjects. I guess you open the proverbial can of worms. Once it gets open, you can't shut me up. So, yeah, I would love to even be more confident talking about various topics. There are certain topics that I still shy away from. Um, but in my, having teenagers in this generation has really opened my eyes to a lot of things that yeah, I had been so naive sexually growing up. I was, from that whole religious background where, you don't talk about sex. The only thing my mom ever said to me was just don't have sex before marriage. That was, the total extent of my sexual education. The church had told me and the youth group had told me don't masturbate. So I didn't even know what masturbation was, literally. And so I was just incredibly, I had read Elizabeth Elliot's book, Passion and Purity, which was, basically save yourself for marriage. Don't kiss until you're at the altar, saying your vows at your wedding, and just very, very strict. So I was very, very strict for myself, trying to be a good Christian. So having children and teenagers now who are secular and realizing that the rules that I had grown up with are absolutely non-existent now. There's no such thing as sin anymore. There's no such thing as premarital sex being wrong anymore. All of that, you know, all those kinds of issues, just they don't mean anything anymore. So I'm trying to be more liberal in my own, talking about subjects, but certain subjects I'm still a little shy. I'd love to do a podcast on orgasms, get right down to the nitty gritty.
Well, I think, yeah, Dr. Daryl Ray would be a perfect
I
guest
know,
for you.
I know. I should get him on one of my every episode with a 7. I decided those are going to be the ones that when I have a guy on. So the next one coming up is 27. So 37 I've already got lined up, and possibly 47. So yeah, like every 2 months or so. Anyways, yeah, so it's those kinds of things, just to try to take the cover off of every can of worms, every topic that gets what are the words? Every topic that you're not allowed to talk about in the church, I think we should start talking about, because for people like myself, I still have so much to learn. I had to learn how to swear because we would get spanked if we swore. I had to learn how to watch horror movies because they were terrible. I had to learn how to watch sci-fi movies because they might have magic in them, and magic is bad. I had to learn all of these things in the last 7 years. I have to learn about evolution. I knew nothing about evolution. I was taking my kids to creation research conferences, before so I've got a long way to go and I have a lot to learn. So,
Okay. Now you've been on the show almost an entire hour. You haven't swore yet. Do you have a favorite swear word that you get to use now? And I just
well, when my husband and I get mad, at life, we just say fuck, and we just walk around fuck. And when he's gone through so many health issues in the last 2 years, and I'll just see him walking down the hallway and he'll just say fuck, and I'll say fuck, because why did he didn't deserve to get cancer at the age of 48. What's a loving God doing, giving him cancer? Is he have cancer because he became an atheist? Is that what all the Christians are saying? And it's no,
yeah.
It's just the way it is. And his body just happened to get cancer. And
So
now he's all over and he's in remission and it's fantastic. And did God heal him? No.
It was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Is that what you said he had? And
yeah,
it's remission right now?
Yeah, it's in remission. So he doesn't have any symptoms. It's awesome.
Congratulations on that.
Yeah.
And we'll see if I can finally throw a question you haven't had yet. So what's harder, raising money to be a Christian missionary to Brazil or trying to get people to donate to your show on Patreon?
Oh, well, I was hesitant at the beginning because I thought, oh, am I just going to be repeating what I had to do in the past? And,
Actually, you mentioned prayer letters, like sending prayer letters,
yeah.
whatever the hell those are, to atheists. I think that would be a big hit because there are a lot of, I'm one of the fortunate, never Christian, never religious, but most people I've talked to are former religious, and of course, North America, Christian. So yeah, if you start putting some prayer letters out there.
What's harder? Well, right now, I have a full-time job. Well, it's actually part-time, 3/4 time job that I do from home. I have a virtual assistant. So I don't technically need the money. I would love to not be doing spreadsheets all day and helping people with emails. I'd rather be making more podcasts and videos and going to conferences and speaking. I would love to do this and maybe work on writing my book finally. And so that would be great. So whereas when it's your only way of putting food on the table and paying for the tickets, to fly to Brazil, then you put a lot of work into those furloughs. And, when you're on furlough, your job is to make people want to support you for the next years, 2, 3, 4 years that you're in the, overseas. So there's a lot of incentive to be a people pleaser, to make people like you, to, my husband and I would sing duets in front of the church, to make our kids act perfectly so that people would see us as being wonderful parents, all of that shit. So yeah, it's that was hard. I don't ever want to go back and do that. I mean, I'd rather work in a factory than have to go and tell people, yeah, you got to support me, or else, you're not being a good Christian. Like, that's just such a bunch of bullshit now. There, I'm getting some swearing in.
Well, you mentioned that you were big into music. So if there was like an atheist kind of karaoke gathering, would you have a song you'd pick out?
That's the other thing I'm really naive about. Being in the church, I was really into Christian music. Stephen Curtis Chapman, Steve Green. I went to see Amy Grant, Phil Keaggy, Gaither Vocal Band, Michael W. Smith, all of them, and I was really into Christian music and not into secular music at all for 25, 30 years. So I don't know very much about secular music. So going to karaoke, I wouldn't know the songs. Like, my kids thankfully have left religion a long time ago. So they know the secular songs. In high school, I was so strict as a Christian that I wouldn't listen to the radio most of the time because it's secular. So there was thankfully one Christian radio station that I'd listen to, thankfully, being a good Christian. But so I have dropped music. Like, since leaving the church, I don't sing in a choir anymore. I don't play my violin. I don't do anything like that. Because what would I play? I don't know any music. So I would love to bring that back. But to me, it's sort of like, I have no desire to sing in a Christian cantata at the Unitarian Church because they're still singing Silent Night, Holy Night, all that fucking stuff. So yeah.
I was wondering, like, I'm sure in karaoke it just depends on how vast the library is, that they probably do have some like Christian or religious songs, but I'm not thinking that'd be something you'd want to sing.
No, that's
unless
the thing.
There's some beverages involved, and I don't
know.
even know if that's your thing, because I know you didn't.
I know.
For years that was like off the table.
I know, it's sort of it feels like there's this big divide in my life from when I left Christianity. There's certain things that I just have no desire to ever do again, or because it was so associated with one religion, like music, that there was one year I worked. It was hard for us to get jobs after we left religion and after we left the missions. So there was one year I worked in a factory, earning minimum wage, and they would have the secular radio station on. So I started listening to whatever happened to be on that year on the radio, but I don't know any of the words for it and stuff. So I miss that part of my life. But then I think, I did a lot of music, so it's not like I have to do any more. I mean, I've had a big run on my music, or done a lot of it already. It's not something that I'm driven for, even though at the time when I first went into missions, I was taking music. I was a music major in Bible college, and taking voice and playing in the orchestra and things like that. But so I guess I miss it a bit, but then I'm filling my life with other things that I never did before, like watching horror movies and sci-fi movies, and going to bars once in a while. And hopefully I want to, become more of a rebel someday and get drunk and maybe get high on weed someday. I don't know. I'm a bit shy still on doing some of those things. Actually, Cass, one of his podcasts, 2 weeks ago, he was talking about going to Denver and buying edibles, and they were gummy bears shaped. And I thought I could do that. Because when I tried to smoke a cigarette a couple years ago, I just coughed the whole time. So it wasn't very fun.
Yeah, my parents bribed me not to smoke. So I basically, when I turned like 22, a friend of mine had a cigarette and I took one puff and I was like, okay. And I was like, if I ever did pot, it would be, I think an edible would be the way to go.
Yeah.
So I'm not
No,
really
I
a
could handle
smoking,
gummy bears. That would be
inhaling
great
type.
fun.
Yeah. So there we go. Event in
And he says
Denver.
it's pretty cheap. Yeah, there you go. He said it was like $15 for I don't know how many grams of gummy bears. I thought I could handle that. So, and he said it would last a couple hours of being happy and laughing. And that sounds like fun. I guess I just want to do some rebellious things because I realize I am still stuck in some mindsets of this is taboo, this is wrong. But then I'll look back over a couple of years and realize, yeah, I've come a long way compared to what I was before. So it's a gradual awakening of what it's like to be free of all of those rules and guilt and shame. And so, yeah.
When you're religious as the Christian female, you felt like you had no agency. What was it like getting that back? Do you feel like you've gained it? Is it something you're always going to be striving for?
It comes and goes. I think I feel more free, sitting behind the mic and talking to other women, and I feel like I have agency, when I am talking to other women. It still is a bit of a challenge to talk to men. I'm talking to you, but we've messaged a bit, and I'm getting to know some of the other atheist men, and I'm realizing most of the atheist men that I'm interacting with are pretty decent men, and I haven't run into any that are real assholes. So in general, I'm getting more of a voice and feeling more free, but it's sometimes that fear will come back, and I'll get a bit of a panic attack when I think of talking to a man or coming out of my comfort zone. So I think it's just a gradual process. So anyways, so far I'm happy with the atheist groups that I've been part of on Facebook. They seem to be pretty respectful in general. I did start a women's Facebook group, secret group, for women that I've interacted with who seem to really need a place that's safe, that they can rant, and that it's free of men for some of those women who are still have some trauma related to patriarchy and misogyny and that, which I had a lot of that trauma, and I'm starting to get over a lot of that after being with a man who's not misogynistic. My second husband is not misogynistic, whereas my first husband was. So yeah.
Gosh, we've gone past the hour. Gosh, we're almost an hour and 10. So I guess we'll have to wrap it up. So how can people find your show and reach out to you?
So yeah, womenbeyondbelief.com is where the website is. Women Beyond Belief podcast is on Facebook, and Twitter is WWB podcast is the Twitter handle. And I'm on Instagram and Pinterest as well. And you have a YouTube channel, which is Women Beyond Belief podcast. So usually if you just Google Women Beyond Belief, you'll either find Karen Garst's book or you'll find me. So pretty much the only two places that you'll find that name. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, reach out, people.
Thank you.
Female voices are needed. Because your stories were going so well, I actually cut out my live read. So I'm going to do real quick mentions to them. See, I'm a proud husband. I've been in podcast game for like 2.5 years, but now my wife is in on it. Allison Law, she started her own. It's called Literary Atlanta, and it's basically stories of local writers. There's a big writers conference coming up in Atlanta in a few weeks, so she's going to interview people. So if you listen to this show, Literary Atlanta, you get to find out a couple things. First, you get to hear the story of authors, and I assume that's not too different than the people I talk to. And 2, you get to see who the better law is at interviewing. Do I see a crossover episode? Well, maybe not, but go to iTunes. You can find that show. And this Saturday, August 12th, will be the first anniversary episode of the Podunk Polymath podcast, which is Chris Watson out of Nashville And I guess because I give him beer every time I see him, or because I was the first person to praise his show, I'm going to be co-hosting. So we're going to be live Saturday night, I think 8:30 Eastern time. And I'm pretty sure there's going to be karaoke involved. And I saved a special beer called the Dirty Commie Heathen Russian Stout from Unknown Brewing for the episode. So usually when I show up on somebody else's show, it's just me nodding verbally. So that's what we'll probably get, but it's going to get a little slurry. Should be fun. So Saturday night, that's what's happening. And now if you want to support this show, you just support Women Beyond Belief. But after that, maybe you want to support this show. So be like Bobby, Hugh, Teody, Marissa, love you, Marissa, and support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/Zachrilege, Zachrilege. If I can spell it after 2 beers, you can spell it too. Follow me on Twitter, like the Zachrilege Cast page on Facebook. Send all hate mail to zachrilege.cast@gmail. And again, thank you, Wendy, for being on tonight.
Thanks
Very
so much,
illuminating.
Zach.
I feel like we could do 3 or 4 more hours and probably not scratch the surface of the experience you've had.
Yeah.
But for now, we have to say goodnight. So for the listeners, stay safe. If you need to chat, I'm available. If you're an atheist and feel alone, you are not alone. Reach out. Let's chat. Get to that human connectedness that keeps people coming back every Sunday. Stay skeptical. Love all y'all, and good night and a gong sound.